I never forgot his name, nor the room number. The file was archived, the records disappeared, and the senior doctors pretended it had never happened. But I saw it. I was there. And no one, absolutely no one, will convince me that it was normal, because I knew the patient. I cared for him. And now, he wears the white coat, the same coat they once said he'd never have the chance to wear. It was a weekend shift, the kind that feels like it will never end. The emergency lights were flickering, and the infirmary phone wouldn't stop ringing. The psychiatric wing had received a new case. Young male. No documents. He'd been found wandering naked behind a train station, completely disoriented. No one knew his name, or where he had come from, but something in his eyes, something made it seem like he already knew us. He was admitted as unidentified patient. New. 0417 for days. He refused to speak. He only drew pages and pages filled with anatomical diagrams, medical diagnoses, hospital floor plans, and they were accurate. Details not even the most experienced interns would know. But he didn't say a single word. On the 8th day, he asked for a clipboard, said he needed to record an urgent clinical progression. The doctors thought it was part of the episode, but when they checked, he had accessed the surgical wing's internal system, using a login that didn't exist. That night, he disappeared. The room was empty. The bed still warm. No signs of forced entry, no alarms triggered. The wing's cameras simply froze. The time of the last footage was 3:14 a.m. After that, nothing. The authorities were called. They tried to erase the episode, archived it as a spontaneous escape of psychiatric patient. But no one ever saw the young man again. No discharge record, no rescue call, no body found. 5 years passed without a single sign of him, until a new hire was made to the hospital's medical residency. A brilliant young man, with a degree from a prestigious university, but no clear family background. And when he walked into the conference room for the first time, I froze. It was him. The same eyes, the same scar on his left hand, the same slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. He looked me in the eyes, smiled, and said, "Pleasure to meet you, Dr. Elias. I always knew you'd be here." I lost the ground beneath my feet. I started digging, went back to the old files. Room 0417 had been deactivated. The patient file gone. Footage from the period, corrupted. No fingerprints, no data, no trace. It was as if the patient had never existed, but I exist, and I remember. Since that day, I started noticing things. He knew where supplies were kept that had never been shown to him. He knew passwords that were never spoken, and he referred to old hospital events, as if he had lived there for years. But no one could explain how a man who vanished without identity was now performing heart surgeries. One night, I tried to confront him. I waited until the end of his shift. He always left through the side tunnel, the one rarely used. I followed, but when I turned the corner, he was gone. Just a badge hanging from the doorknob with his name and the birth date. Same as patient 0417. I ran back to the infirmary. I needed to tell someone, anyone, but no one took me seriously. They said it was exhaustion, stress, all in your head. But if it were in my head, why did he leave me a note? The next morning, I found a folded piece of paper in my locker, written in firm handwriting. Some patients don't return, healed, some return, to finish what they started. Since then, he's been working normally. Patients love him. The directors praise him. But something's wrong. Something no one else seems to notice, except me, because sometimes, when he walks past me, he whispers, "You'll forget too, won't you?" And that's when I ask myself, if he wasn't a doctor when he arrived, if he wasn't even identified, how did he know exactly who I was from the very beginning? In the days that followed, I tried to go about my routine as usual, but it was impossible not to feel his presence, even when he wasn't around. There was something about the way his footsteps echoed in the hallways, a precise rhythm, as if every movement had been rehearsed in advance. It was almost as if the entire hospital adjusted itself to his presence. And, as strange as it sounds, the silence seemed to obey him. I began writing everything down in a notebook, hidden inside the pediatric wing's supply closet. Dates, phrases, glances, even the moments when he simply ... appeared, because sometimes, he would show up in places where no one had seen him enter, and disappear without crossing any doors. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. But coworkers whispered their own suspicions that the new resident was too good to be real. One early morning, I saw him enter the isolation wing, a restricted area accessible only by key. I was off duty but had returned to retrieve a book I had left in the break room. I followed him discreetly. I watched him go in. The strangest part, there were no patients assigned to that wing that day. I waited outside for more than an hour. No sounds, no movement. When I finally gathered the courage to open the door, the room was empty, and the smell of ether was far stronger than usual. There was also an old stethoscope left on the examination table, an antique, with the initials E.J. engraved, the same as the unidentified patient from 5 years ago. The next day, I questioned the wing coordinator about Elias being in the isolation sector. He denied it, said the keys were locked away, and that no requests had been made. I pressed him. He smiled and replied, "You must be tired. Besides, Elias wasn't even on shift that night." But I saw him. I swear to God, I saw him. I started avoiding being alone with him. Even when everything seemed normal, the air around him carried a weight that others seemed to ignore. But he noticed my discomfort, and made a point of crossing paths with me in the hallways, always with the same calm tone. "You're still trying to understand, aren't you?" One day, I found a report written by him in the system, signed, approved, with flawless protocols. But what made my blood run cold was the patient referenced in the chart. Number 0417. The same admission number as the missing patient. The most impossible part, the document was dated 2 years before his supposed reappearance. I went to asked for a log check. They said the report had been entered into the system in real time, and that the user, Dr. Elias J., had existed since 2013. But the patient had been admitted in 2020, and the hospital system had only been created in 2017. I started getting sick, not physically, but inside my head. Everything felt off balance. I began doubting myself. But at the same time, I started finding other things, hidden notes, pieces of paper with the diagrams he used to draw, old medical codes, no longer in use, but matching exactly the procedures he performed. I spoke to a retired doctor, quietly shared what was happening. He turned pale, took me to his house and showed me an old yearbook from the hospital's first residency class. The image was yellowed with age, but it was him, Elias, the same face, the same expression. And the caption below read, "Class of 1984, my blood froze. I went home in shock, searched through everything, the note, the documents, the sketches. I tried to build a timeline, but nothing made sense. How could someone disappear, reappear as a doctor, and have records from decades earlier? And why, out of all the staff, was I the only one who seemed to remember he had been a patient? I started observing more, recording audio in secret, taking photos. But whenever I tried to show them to someone, the files disappeared. The pictures came out corrupted. The audio, blank. One night, I came home to find my camera thrown on the floor, and a sticky note on the door. "Not everything that's remembered needs to be shared." I began sleeping with the light on, afraid I'd wake up having forgotten everything, afraid of becoming one of those people who smiled at him without recognizing what he was, because whatever is beneath that white coat is not just a doctor. I saw him touch a terminal patient, just a light touch. The heart monitor stabilized. The patient's pupils returned to normal. Everyone celebrated, except me, because the patient whispered something before regaining consciousness. He showed me what's on the other side. I requested leave. They said it was burnout, that I needed rest. But I knew that if I stayed away too long, I'd forget everything, because time around him seems to have an effect. He drains the past, rewrites the records, and leaves no trace. I returned earlier than scheduled. A colleague handed me an envelope, no sender. Inside, a copy of the original chart for patient 0417, with a red note, "Will return in 5 years. Roll, doctor." It's as if everything was already written, as if this hospital is merely a stage where he fulfills his cycles, as if he belongs to this place in a way no one else does. And even now, as I write these lines, I know that he knows that he's watching me, that maybe he's waiting for me to understand. But the question that won't let me sleep is, if he didn't come from the future ... and he doesn't belong to the past ... where did he come from exactly? Even when everything seemed calm, even when he smiled during rounds or cracked jokes over coffee, there was something behind that look. Something that wasn't human. Not exactly it wasn't evil, but it wasn't neutral either. He seemed to carry a memory far vaster than his body could reveal. As if every cell of his knew what was coming next. As if he were playing a role far too old to forget. I quietly returned to my investigation. It was no longer just about him. It was about the hospital. About everything that had been swept under the clean sheets and sterile hallways. I began hearing whispers of old disappearances, unexplained cases of patients, staff, even visitors, who had vanished, and returned years later, with new names, new roles. I found a retired janitor, who had worked there in the 90s. He welcomed me into his home, eyes lowered. I told part of the story, omitting the more surreal details, but when I mentioned the name Elias, he trembled, said that name had appeared on different badges, in different decades. That man doesn't age. He changes titles, changes clothes, but it's always him. Always him, ... He repeated with sweaty hands. One night, I decided to break into the physical archives, the room of old records, the one everyone claimed had been under renovation for years. I used an old badge I found in a drawer in the maintenance department. When I walked in, the smell of aged paper and mold nearly knocked me over. Hundreds of files stacked, names erased, dates scratched out, but among them, I found something different. It was a folder marked only with the initials, E. Inside were reports dating back to 1972. All described medical procedures carried out by a resident with those same initials. But the most bizarre part, all the patients he treated were listed as disconnected from the system, as if they had never existed. Most were psychiatric patients, terminally ill, or had no family. On the last page, a sentence was highlighted in blue ink. The cycle restarts every 5 years. He returns when the hospital needs him. Signed by someone named Clinical Director PC. A name I had never heard before. The next day, Elias stopped me in the hallway. He stared at me for a few seconds, and then said quietly, "Not everything you found, you'll be able to keep." And then he smiled, but not arrogantly. It was the smile of someone who knows there's no going back. I tried to confront the administration, went to the ombudsman, showed documents, tried to ask questions, and then, for the first time in 12 years at the hospital, I received a formal warning letter. Unstable conduct, 30-day leave for psychiatric evaluation. It was an order, not a suggestion. I began to wonder if all of this was even real, if my mind wasn't creating an elaborate fiction to make sense of the inexplicable. But then a new nurse was hired, young, enthusiastic, and on her first day he greeted her by saying, "Welcome back." How could he know? How could it be back? If she had never worked here before? That's when I decided to talk to her, alone. I brought coffee to the break room, and struck up a conversation, and in the middle of it, I asked if she had ever been to the hospital before. She went quiet, looked around, and answered, "No, but I've dreamed of these hallways since I was 15. I always knew I'd be here one day." That same day, I found a new chart in my locker, blank, but with my name printed at the top, correct date of birth, but under hospital admission, it said, scheduled for 6 years from now, as if ... I hadn't even been admitted yet. That night was the worst. I had intense nightmares. I dreamed I was strapped to a hospital bed, with people watching me from behind. Glass, a monitor beeped steadily, and Elias, dressed in a completely black coat, whispered, "You're starting to remember, aren't you? We've been through this before." I woke up drenched in sweat, panicked, but something was even worse. On my bed was his badge, and a torn page from my notebook, with a sentence written in my own handwriting. He didn't return, he simply continued. I thought of running away, resigning, disappearing from all of this, but something held me back. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep sense that if I left, I would forget everything, and maybe that's exactly what he wanted. I went back to researching old records. I found an article published in 1989 by a doctor, Elias J., discussing hospital temporal resonance, something that sounded like science fiction. The text spoke of individuals who exist in multiple cycles of care, embedded in clinical environments as fixed observation points. It was almost as if he were describing ... himself. I couldn't find any university with official records of him, no passport, no bank history. He simply exists inside the hospital, and only here, as if he were part of the structure, as if he were part of the foundation, as if the hospital were a living organism, and he, its core. I spoke with an intern, an observant kid, always alert. I sat next to him in the cafeteria and casually asked what he thought of Dr. Elias. The boy replied, "He's amazing, but there's something weird. Sometimes he seems to know what we're going to say before we say it." I stopped chewing. The boy then added, "Sometimes I think he dreams about us before we even get here." The final straw was when I received an email from my own address, dated next year. The body of the message, just one sentence: "You chose to remember, that has consequences." Now, every step I take inside the hospital is followed by a presence, not physical, but constant, as if the walls know I'm closer to the truth than ever before, as if everything is being orchestrated. I no longer know if I'm alive or just dreaming a cycle I can't escape. But what haunts me isn't the doubt about who he is. What torments me most is, if he's the doctor, and I'm the only one who remembers, what else in this hospital is living the same cycle, and pretending not to know? I began to realize I wasn't just observing the cycles. I was inside them, as if, at some point, I had stopped being a spectator and become part of the mechanism. With every shift, something repeated. Patients with names identical to old files, dates that kept crossing paths, clocks that froze in the triage room, always at 3:14. Always that number, always that moment frozen in time. Elias now seemed to observe me less, as if he was already sure I had understood enough. And maybe that was what he had wanted from the start, for me to accept, to stop fighting the impossible and surrender to the absurd logic that ruled that place. I found an old diary hidden behind a power panel in the hospital. It belonged to a nurse named Clara, dated 1967. Every page described a new resident who seemed to know too much. She called him the doctor who had already lived all of it before. In a final note, there was only one sentence: "If you're reading this, it's because you've started to remember too." I went back to searching for information about Clinical Director PC, the one who had signed the old reports. I discovered he was the hospital's founder, but his death was never officially recorded. In the older hallways, I found a bronze plaque with his image covered in gray paint, as if they wanted to hide him. But the eyes on the statue were the same as Elias's. That's when I understood. Elias wasn't a name. It was a role, a function, a cycle that reincarnates in someone's body whenever the hospital needs to preserve what cannot be revealed. Maybe he had been many men, maybe he had been no one, but he always came back. I remembered a patient who had disappeared years ago, an elderly woman named Marlene. She had vanished from her bed without a trace. They said she had dementia and might have wandered off, but no one ever saw her again. Last week, a visitor arrived at reception asking for her son, Elias. When I went to check, I saw an old woman with white hair and a distant look. It was Marlene, but she hadn't aged a single day. I asked her name. She answered, in a trembling voice. He said he would return when I woke up, and then, she disappeared again, simply vanished inside the reception bathroom. The door closed, and, when we opened it, no one was there. I started investigating the ventilation ducts, the lower levels of the building. I discovered a floor below the basement, sealed off with rusty gates. No one talked about it, but documents referred to that sector as Zone 0. The entrance was sealed with old police tape. I broke in. What I saw down there took my breath away. An entire abandoned wing, with beds, files, old monitors, and black and white photographs. In every image, there he was, in different clothes, different ages, but always with the same face. In one, he wore a military uniform, holding a folder, with a hospital symbol. A wall mural displayed something even more disturbing. A map of the hospital, with red-marked points, and below it, a sentence in small letters: "Where there is healing, there is control. Where there is control, there is permanence." I left trembling, but I took one of the files with me. It belonged to a nurse named Raquel. I searched the employee records and discovered that Raquel was my mother. But she had never told me. She worked there, and more. Her resignation file stated, "Transferred to the cycle of return date, unknown." I confronted my mother the next day. She was in shock, denied everything at first, but after a few minutes of silence, she looked me in the eyes and said, "You found Zone 0, didn't you? Now it's too late." She then told me she had worked as a nursing technician for a year, until she met Elias, that he had promised to preserve everything that matters, and that one day, she simply woke up, outside the hospital, with all her memories erased. Except for one, his name. From that day on, I started forgetting things too. Names of patients, surgery dates, shifts I had worked the day before. It was as if a silent eraser was wiping away my past, one line at a time. I began writing everything down, sticking notes around the house. But some disappeared. Others showed up with phrases I hadn't written. One of them, stuck to the mirror, read, "You're almost ready to replace." Replace what or who? I went back to zone zero the next night. But now, everything was gone. The wing no longer existed. Where there had been gates, there was now just a smooth wall, as if it had been swallowed by the hospital itself. I started seeing people in the corridors that no one else could see. A boy in a lab coat with very old eyes. A woman in an apron smiling endlessly. A child holding a blank chart. And they all said the same thing as they passed me. "He's waiting." I tried to leave. Filed a formal resignation. But the system rejected it. My name appeared as an integration process. I went to administration. They said my contract was blank. "You haven't officially started here, miss. Your admission is scheduled for 2031. My legs nearly gave out. At home, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. And on the other end, his voice, "You now belong to the hospital." The next day, my photo was on the reception mural, next two faces I didn't recognize, all with the same strange dates, and the badge on my uniform had a new role, supervisor of the cycle of return. What I never wanted to understand was now right in front of me, and the question is no longer about him. It is, how many of us work here without knowing we never actually left? I don't sleep the same anymore. There's something in the silence of the night that watches me. It's not a noise, not a presence, it's awareness. As if now, the hospital sees me fully, not as an employee, but as part of it. A living part, an essential part. And the more I try to pull away, the more it draws me back in. The walls recognize me. The automatic doors open before I get close. The emergency alarms go off when I try to leave without notice. And the patients now look at me as if they know. As if they see in me the same thing I once saw in Elias. The mirror of something far beyond medicine. Today, I have access to areas that don't appear on any map. Sectors where time seems to move differently. I've seen people walking in clothes from past decades. I've seen doctors performing procedures in complete silence, as if following instructions no one else can see. I've seen patients waking up from surgery and speaking dates from the future. One night, I looked at myself in a locker room mirror and didn't recognize myself at first. Not because of my face, but because of my eyes. I had seen that look before. In Elias, in Clara, in Marlene, in all those who remained. There was a kind of serenity disconnected from reality, as if time no longer moved, as if everything were on repeat. I began to understand that the hospital wasn't a building. It was a fixed point between times, a link between different versions of ourselves. Those who disappear are not lost, they are absorbed. And those who return, come back different. What changes is only our ability to notice. I got an urgent call to room 1 to be in the pediatric wing. A boy had just woken up from a 4-year coma. When I arrived, he looked me in the eyes and said, "You're new here, right? But you're going to last." Then he closed his eyes again. He wasn't just a child, he was a message. In the staff kitchen, I started noticing that some colleagues never ate, never drank, were always on duty. But no one ever scheduled them. When I asked, others would say, "Oh, that one's always around," even if nobody sees him, as if it were normal, as if seeing or not seeing someone didn't matter, because their presence was permanent. A nurse I shared shifts with pulled me aside. She said she had been dreaming about the hospital for months, even while at home, and that in the dreams, Elias always appeared with a notebook, writing down names. The most frightening part, in her last dream, the name he wrote down was mine. I went to the archives and searched for my own name. Nothing. No entry. No exit. No admission. No history. As if I didn't exist in the records, even though I'd been there for years. But when I typed supervisor of the cycle of return, an image popped up. It was me. But the date, 1985. Time stopped making sense. My memories began to collide. Sometimes I remembered shifts that hadn't happened yet. Patients who wouldn't be admitted for years. Doctors who hadn't even graduated. But to me, they felt familiar. As if everything had already been lived, again, and again, and again. Elias crossed paths with me in the hallway one night. He stopped, touched my shoulder, and said only, "It's almost time." Time for what? I went up to the hospital rooftop, a place hardly anyone visits. Up there, I found an old, rusted chair and an open notebook with the phrase, "Final observation." She accepted. I went back inside. The lights were dimmer. The hallways, longer. I felt like I was on a different shift, in a different version of myself, as if that night had already happened, exactly the same. Only I didn't remember. In the psychiatric wing, I saw patient 0417. Yes, him, sitting, waiting for me, but now wearing a white coat and a badge that read Senior Instructor. I walked toward him, frozen. He smiled and said, "Your training ends today. The cycle will restart." I stood there, still, knowing that in that moment, something would be sealed, a choice. But in truth, it was never mine. I simply accepted. When I returned to my unit, everything was different. The clothes, the furniture, the clocks showed another decade. I looked at my reflection in the door and saw a different haircut, a different posture, but the same eyes, the same ones I saw in Elias, the same ones I saw in the statue of the director. That's when I understood the hospital is a place of preserved consciousness, a cycle where those who know too much continue to serve between times. People who chose not to leave, or who never could. In the meeting room, the faces were all familiar, but no one said names, only nods, glances, silent notes. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone had already been there before. I saw a new resident arriving, young, curious, lost. I remembered myself. I remembered that feeling of strangeness. I approached him and, before he could say anything, I said, "Welcome back. Life out there goes on, but the hospital is something else. It doesn't just heal wounds, it stores memories. And sometimes, it stores people." Elias disappeared. Maybe he completed his cycle. Maybe he just changed form. But I still feel his presence in the elevators, in the reflections on the windows, in the pause between the monitor beeps. Now I ask myself, how many of us believe we've left the hospital, but are still living inside it, trapped in other names, other roles? Because if the exit door exists, I've never seen anyone cross it, and maybe, it's not even meant to be crossed. If you made it this far, it means you felt it too. You've seen the cycles, and maybe, you're closer than you think. Subscribe to the channel now. Leave a like if this story got to you. And tell me in the comments, have you ever felt like you'd been somewhere, even before you ever arrived there?